This is the traditional way that a sumi-e painter or a brushwork painter grinds ink. And it's waterproof and it's very dark, very, very black, and you can get it thick enough to where you can do some things that you wouldn't be able to do with the liquid ink. There is liquid ink available, but I was taught this, and so this is how I do it, and this is how I teach it. And so you just kind of keep grinding until you get this nice consistency that's sort of like cream, and that's your basis for the painting. And then you make grays, you can use other colors, you can use water, so that's your palette, is from clear water to the deepest black and kind of all the grays in between. So this one I actually brought back from Tasmania, which is just a gorgeous brush, and it's actually functional. I have used it on a really big commission piece that I had. So they come in all sizes.
Is it a certain kind of bristles?
Well, there's many different kinds. There's soft brushes, which is what this is. The white ones tend to be soft. That means that they give really easily when you load them up. They're good for washes. And then there's harder brushes, which tend to be darker, and those are brushes that have either like fox or horse or an animal with more brittle hair, and this is oftentimes rabbit or goat, or a very soft bristle. But the harder ones are for doing detail work, doing rocks, doing craggy things, rocks, trees, whereas this would be for flowers and soft animals and birds, and but then you would use this for the bird's legs, so you go back and forth between brushes, choosing whatever brush is going to work for you. There's basically 5 brush strokes in Chinese brushwork. And from those strokes, modified, is how you come up with your composition. So whenever I'm teaching a class, I always start with teaching the 5 strokes. And the first stroke is the leaf stroke, which is this stroke right here. And it's the leaves on flowers, it's the leaves on trees, it's bamboo leaves. And what you try to do when you do these brush strokes is you try to be able to do them all the way around in a circle, so that, because obviously things don't grow in just one way, so you want to be able to manipulate the brush all the way around. And because of that, you don't hold the brush like you would a pencil. You hold the brush like you would chopsticks. And what that does is it lifts the heel of your hand off the table so that you have freedom to go in all these different directions. And that's very important in brushwork, because when you're trying to copy nature, you want to have the flexibility to go in any direction with any of these strokes. So this is the leaf stroke. The next stroke is a bone stroke. And that is very different than the leaf. That is bearing down, pulling, and then bearing down again. And this is the stock for bird's legs. It's bamboo. It's mountains, cragginess. It's a much drier stroke. You let the ink run out, so you get these really nice dry strokes. And as you continue to shorten up on the brush, you get smaller and smaller extensions of this until you're just using the very tip of the brush and your pinky. That's what gives you support. And then when you come back and add a little bone stroke in these joints, you end up with bamboo. And from there you can paint leaves, And connect the leaves. So that's how you build bamboo from just these two strokes. Those are the two strokes that are involved in bamboo. The next stroke is a nailhead stroke. And that is got the beginning of the bone stroke and the end of the leaf stroke. So whereas the leaf stroke goes like this and the bone goes like this, the nailhead goes like this. And the ink is actually really, but it's nice to have that thickness because you can see how black the ink is. This is a waterproof ink. You don't ever want to get it on your clothing. It will never come off. I always wear black when I'm painting because it can be it's waterproof, and once it's on there it doesn't go away. So the nail head is for things like the pine branch, which is just sort of a modified nail head stroke, and the pine needles, which are also modified nail head strokes. And if we want to add a little bit more, oh, I didn't turn my phone off. I guess I should do that. Can actually make a little pine cone to go with this. So every one of these strokes is what you end up doing your composition with. It's understanding how each one of the strokes works and being able to manipulate them in ways that work for you, that actually captures nature. And that is what, that's kind of the point of brushwork, is to do as few strokes as possible, as efficient strokes as possible, and capture the essence of the subject matter that you're after. So it's a lifelong practice, and I've been doing it since I was 22. So I've been doing it for 2/3 of my life now. Exactly 2/3 of my life, which is
very nice.
Amazing. Still surprised me that I've gotten away with doing this for 2/3 of my life. Simple. However, it is really used a lot in brushwork, and that's just dots. There's 3 different kinds of dots. And to do this, you come way down on the shaft of the brush because you're just using the very tip of the brush. So the smaller your stroke, the closer you are to the shaft of the brush. The bigger the stroke, the farther away you get so that you can do big sweeping things with your brushes. So when you use your pinky, that just gives you a little bit of leverage, but what you never want to do is put the heel of your hand down on the table, because what that does is it stops you from moving your hand, and then you just don't have the same amount of control. So if you use your pinky, you move your pinky everywhere you move your hand. And so the dots are just very simple. They're just dots. This is your basic dot. I like to do spirals because I like spirals. And then the next dot is what I call a dot with attitude, because it has a little tiny tail on it. And this is the dot that is used in Chinese calligraphy and in Japanese calligraphy. When you see a character that has a dot, it's always a dot with a little tiny bit of a tail. So it's not a stroke, it's still a dot, but it's just when you leave the paper, you add this little tail to it. Hi! Hello! And so that's the 4th stroke. And then the 5th stroke is one of my favorites. That is the petal stroke. And the petal stroke is obviously what you use for petals of flowers. It's also the heads of birds. It's often used in clouds, skies, anything that's soft, anything that is alive and has juice in it. You use the petal stroke. And the petal stroke is simply laying the brush down and turning it, and then coming back where you started. So you end up with sort of a teardrop shape. And if you do this 5 times,
Well, if you could read that.
Oh yeah, it is.
you end up with a plum blossom. So that is those are the 5 strokes that you use in brushwork. And then you can add other things if you want to continue to finish off your flower. You add the stamens and the pollen sacs, and you give it a little stem. So those are the 5 strokes, and using those or using modifications from those is how you make brushwork. And obviously there's strokes that you're going to use that are not just these 5 strokes, and the more you do brushwork, the more you start coming up with your own ways of manipulating the brush, manipulating the stroke. But having these 5 strokes down to a point where you don't even have to think about doing them really well and really exactly the way you want them to be, that is the foundation of brushwork, of knowing how to then manipulate the brush. Brushwork is about control of the brush. And so by doing these strokes, you gain control of the brush. And I've had over the years, I've had oil painters, I've had Paul Murray, one of your best artists here. He took my brushwork class because he was moving from pastels into oils, and he wanted to get more control over the brush, and so he took an 8-week class from me many years ago. But it was really cool to have him in the class, because his reputation preceded him, and I knew him from the shows, and it was just nice to have him there. And he did really well. He learned a lot. So anyway, so maybe I will paint a little.
What are we going to paint now?
We're going to paint some plum. So another part of this, which I haven't even talked about, is charging the brush. So we've ground this ink, we've made gray, which is kind of halfway between the clear water and the black ink. And charging the brush, when you charge the brush, you then have to condition the brush. All these brushes are meant to be used with a point. They all have a point when they're wet, and you have to start the stroke with the point. And so that needs to be intact. So part of the whole process is charging the brush, and then also is blotting the brush. So paper towels are almost important as the brushes are, because you have to blot so that you get whatever consistency in the brush stroke that you're looking for. The idea with brushwork is to know what your brush is going to do before it ever hits the paper. So you know what kind of brush you have, you know how you charge the ink, you know where the ink is, and you know the paper that you're using. It's these 3 parts that make brushwork. And you change any of those. You change the paper, you change the brush, you change the ink, and it's different. You have to regroup, especially with the paper, because every paper is different. This is a really beautiful paper called Dragonfly, and it's got a lot of fiber running through it. And it's not sized, and so what that means is that it will take the ink very quickly. So if you have too much ink on your brush, you end up with it just pooling. Now I probably let the whole thing dry out, so let me start over again. So you blot, you get all the water out, then you charge, then you condition, and then you blot again to get all the excess out. And then you make your stroke, which I've blotted really well. So that's a modified nail head. And come up here and add another branch, maybe another one right here. Leave a space for a flower. So this is the parent of the plum. Now we're going to add children. Children are newer and straight new growth. So we're going to add a few of those. And then we're going to add the flowers. I'll go ahead and do these in red. I didn't bring, well, I did bring some white. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and do them in red. So these are pigment chips. This is not regular watercolor. These are actually pigments that I get in little tiny squares that I put into this container and then melt them down with water. And then they can be rehydrated anytime. So remember the blossom stroke? Now we're going to do that with this on paper. A little bit smaller. Fit it in to that space. And then we add some others, but not all the flowers face the same direction. They face all different directions. So we're going to make some flowers that are going different directions. Ideally in a painting, none of your flowers are ever going the same way. They're always going a different way because that's how it is in nature. So you kind of get used to it. And this is what I'm talking about, how you manipulate the different strokes. Yes, you start off with that petal stroke, but if you want your flowers to go different directions, you've got to manipulate those strokes to do the things that you want them to do. So you start with the mechanics, with knowing exactly what your brush is going to do, and then you start improvising and getting intuitive. Put a few little buds on here. One more flower. Let's see. Plums tend to cluster, so I like to do little clusters of flowers. So I'm going to put one more here to make our cluster complete. And then this probably needs to dry for just a few minutes before I go back and add the innards of the I can add it on the buds though right now. So you need, everything needs to be connected at some point to where it is that you're coming from. Let's see if this is dry enough. I think this one is. What kind of painting do you do?
Well, I haven't painted in a while. My son, he's 20 now, so I have to get back into it.
Composition of, and why don't we put a dragonfly on it?
Oh yeah.
Just because I've got a lot of dragonflies on a lot of things. It's kind of, I guess that's one of my signature paintings is the dragonfly. And the dragonfly sort of leaps off from the five strokes as far as it doesn't involve, it involves, some of them involves nail heads, it involves, you could actually put one on here, there must be one around somewhere. Are there dragonflies? Gotta be
There's one right
dragonflies
here.
there. Okay. I was gonna say.
Yep,
Better
there's
be,
a
if
few.
there's not, I better bring some.
Yeah, we have some dragonflies.
So, in order to paint a dragonfly, you start with not so much the strokes as more actual painting. Then you're doing a leaf stroke for the body. And then you're doing bone strokes for the tail. And little bones for the legs. Not quite as wide as I would like it. Oops, that went the wrong way. Okay, that way, that way. And then the actual wings are a nailhead stroke that's tipped. So you start way out here and then you come toward the body. It's very slow. You just take your time and let the paper absorb the ink. And you get this nice dry brush effect that is very much like what a dragonfly's wings look like. And then I like to, color in brushwork is very minimal. It's nice to, I like to put just a touch of color on things, and the plum is one of the more colorful designs I do actually, because it actually, the main flower, although I've done many plums with just having gray flowers instead of the pink. But so that's one composition. Very nice paper, very different paper. We will play around with some landscape. So landscape, you do something different with your brushes. You use larger brushes. So this is a large flow brush. And you charge your brushes differently. You use white water, you use clear water. And you blot. You put gray in for half of the brush, and you blot. And then you tip it with the black and blot. And then you go to your painting. And this is how you do landscape in brushwork. So it's very abstract. It's very abstract. It's very impressionistic. The Impressionists actually studied the Asian artists. Before Impressionism came along, there was brushwork. As you can see, it's extremely impressionistic. And the paper also this is a really nice paper for landscape because it's got a lot of teeth. So it's got a roughness that pulls the brushes, kind of splits the brushes so you get these hairs, you get individual hairs and you get that dry brush that happens, which is really, really nice and a nice way to do the strokes. So you really have to take your time. You have to let the paper absorb to not be in a hurry, and you have to be very consistent in what you're trying to do. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what you're doing, but you need to know the stroke that you want to do it with. So if you're trying to rush or you're trying to not charge correctly, then you end up with this not looking foggy, you end up with too much water or too much black or too much gray. So it's very important that the charge of the brush is under your control. Then when we want to come back and add a few details, we take another brush and we can do things like add trees. Let's add some trees here.
And now put it on there. You like the paper. This is good. I got it.
You can get really fine line with these smaller strokes. Oh, there's another composition. So I tend to do, the older I get, the longer I do this, the more simpler my compositions have become. When I first started doing this, I tended to fill up the whole page. But in brushwork, ideally, half of the page is left white. Because then, what your eye does is it goes to the individual strokes. It's forced into looking at what's there, which there isn't a whole lot of. And that's why every stroke is so important. So it's not only the older I get, but I think just the more comfortable I get with my medium, the more confidence I have in my strokes, the easier it is for me to see something as being finished when somebody else might really want to put a whole lot more around it. But the integrity of brushwork is that the fewer the strokes, the better. The fewer strokes it takes to capture this moment or this subject matter, the more successful the painting is.
Mm-hmm.
The nice thing about this sword is that it uses all of the, do it this way, uses all of the strokes, just about. Yeah, I think it uses all 5 actually. So, first is the petal stroke. This is kind of a non-stroke, but I guess this would be a modified leaf stroke. We got to give it a name.
Hi, how are you looking so far? Doing great, yeah. They look really good. You did a great job. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's that bigger one that you offer. Yes, right. So when they sent these frames, they didn't send that one. Okay, that's fine. Yeah. That's the only one. That's the only stuff. That's fine. Okay, that's fine. I was starting to get worried, wondering. Oh, no, okay, good. I'm glad you came in.
You have your 8-stroke bird. We'll put him on a little perch. This is the bird that I teach to students in the beginning course because it doesn't have any legs on him. And the legs get a little bit harder to do. So that's my simple bird. And then I do cranes and herons and bush tits and nuthatches and tanagers and ducks, lots and lots of birds. I try to do specific birds now. This is a bird that's in a little flock, a not a bush tit. Yeah, bush tit. This is a bush tit. God, there we go. Sometimes my mind just doesn't want to cooperate with me.
Notice that
Yes,
those were the nail.
This is the nail heads here. Nail head, dot, dot, petal, and then leaf. 2 leaf strokes. So it actually involves all of the, except for the bone stroke. That's the only one that's not on here. And if this bird had legs, it would have bone stroke as well.
Okay.
So it's this is a nice bird to do when you're learning the strokes, because then you start realizing how the strokes can fit together, and how when you're doing them correctly, you get a finished product from doing these strokes correctly. And that's the thing that I'm constantly trying to make my students aware of, is that if you don't do the strokes right, you're never going to get what it is that you're after, because you have to have that foundation of the strokes.
Well, Pat, thank you so much for doing this demonstration for us. What lovely work you do. Very excited.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Maria.